So hello, everyone, and welcome to the Higher Ed Endeavor Network Equity and Racial Justice Learning Track. And to those listening later, we welcome you to this special podcast edition from Complete College America's annual convening in Baltimore. I am Jamia Stokes, and I'm the Alliance Engagement Director for the Southeast region at CCA, and I'm going to be your moderator for this session. Today's conversation asks a big question. What does courageous leadership require right now in higher education, especially when scrutiny is intense and the stakes for students and communities are high? We're going to be drawing on the civil rights movement's legacy of coalition building. We'll explore how leaders can defend higher education's essential promise while reckoning honestly with its limitations and how we move toward a more equitable future together. For those in the room, I'd ask for you to silence your devices. And if you're going to ask questions later, we'll be sure to make sure that you have a microphone. So for my panel, I'm honored to be joined by two leaders who are living in this work every day. Dr. Kijua Sanders-McMurtry, a CCA Fellow and Vice President for Equity and Inclusion at Holyoke College, a strategist and an educator known for centering community healing and institutional change, and Dr. Margaret Montgomery-Richard, a CCA Fellow and a consultant who partners with campuses and systems on transformation with an equity lens, bringing deep expertise in coalition building across stakeholders. Thank you both for being here with us today. So I'm going to start with some framing to get us started in this conversation. And so before we jump deep into this conversation, I'm going to ask for you to talk about equity and to keep an equity-minded focus in this conversation. And as we think about responses, we're going to think about an asset-based narrative as we talk about the students and the communities that we serve. So to start, I'd like to be grounded in some context of this moment that we're in right now, this moment in higher education. And I'm hoping that you can talk about how this moment is different from other times that you've experienced in higher education.
I'll start as Kijua, Sanders-McMurtry. It's interesting. I think, I don't know, for many people, I think there is this notion that 2025 is distinctly different, and there's all sorts of reasons, right, why we might see it that way. But if you've worked in higher education, you know that it's always turbulent. There's always some tumultuous, ways that things evolve, even like the political discourse on campuses evolves over time based upon the current moment. So it is distinctive in that I think there's a particular kind of attack on higher education, and I would name pretty openly that I consider myself part of the resistance to that attack on higher education. But I would say that if higher education has always sort of been, the pieces of how we've had to evolve have always been complex based upon what the needs are of society, what the contemporary issues are, what the contemporary social ills are in the world. And so while it is a little bit distinctive in that there's been such a public attack, I think, those of us who have some stick-to-itiveness are going to be sort of just continue to build ourselves up and recognize that it's part of the work that we do to respond to the current issues. So that's how I see it currently.
Well, I haven't been in it for a long time and have seen the ebbs and flow of it. I'm a very practical person, okay? So the ebbs and flow of higher ed, for me, I've seen it in my state where a governor comes in and he decides he may close the institution. And what it feels like today, we always had some cover. We could go to the Department of Ed, we could go to EEO, we could go to something that was a buffer. Let's say we had buffers. All holes are bored now. The buffers are gone. We don't have those avenues by which we could go in and collectively fight at, I'll say, governmental level, okay? So yes, we're gonna stay in this because we know education is still the key, and I will say that all the way through for moving people. And our keynote speaker just a moment ago really touched on so much of what I believe in. So I've never seen it like this before. I've never seen it like this before. I've never felt where all of our buffers were being torn down, because technically speaking, education was a sacred cow at every level. K through 12 had a little more intrusion, but higher ed did not have what we see going on here. And when your Ivy League institutions start to, are under attack, you know, they were more sacred than the rest of us. And so I've never seen it like this before, and it is very concerning. And so we all need to be prepared for the fight, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about what that will look like.
That's right. And along those lines, you know, speaking to how difficult it is right now in higher education with the political landscape, with the pressures, the demographic shift that we're facing, and the financial pressure and constraints that we're experiencing, what keeps you in the work? And I'll ask you to respond first, Margaret.
Because I know the work is right and good. I believe that this is still, here we go, education is still the key. This is the only way we know we can move people from one station in life to the next. You know, we don't look at education as that building block. From K through 12, we are building. In every level of higher education, I think it was the Pew Institute that did some research years ago that showed every level of education a person receives really helps to advance them in their station in life.
That's right.
And I will stay in that fight because I am such a believer of that. As a first-generation college grad, one who earned the highest degree you could possibly attain in higher ed, I'm not going to give up the fight because I believe all of us deserve an opportunity. Access and opportunity is the key. And so I'm here. Somebody raised me up. Somebody opened doors for me. And I intend to do the same for others.
Yeah, I think I would answer that question in two ways. One is I have the good fortune of having studied the history of higher education as part of my graduate work. And when Harry S. Truman was president, one of the things he did was create a special commission on higher education. It was chaired by someone named George Zook. And it was interesting, during that period, they were studying, like, can a democracy exist without an educated group mass, an educated populace? And you can probably imagine how I would say that Truman Commission report, what it indicated. But those moments in history where people have collectively come together to decide that higher education is the transformative force that makes the difference in the quality of life for individuals, whether you're studying public health and looking at how health disparities are connected to educational inequities, whether you're studying, first-generation college students. I myself entered college as a high school dropout, went to a community college, and really my life was transformed by the opportunities that I had at that 2-year community college. It's the only reason I went to get an undergraduate degree or get graduate degrees. And so we know the power of transformation, and many of us in this room probably could talk about the different anecdotal stories we have. And I think that we should understand that in this moment, our North Star, I know for me personally, my North Star is access, equity, and inclusion. That is why I, entered the higher education field. It's why I continue to teach and work as an administrator in higher education. And so, I go back to what my grandmother calls that, having that strong constitution and that stick-to-itiveness. I'm not giving up, and I'm not going to give up or be daunted by the current administration's policies on higher education. But I do agree that it is challenging, it is troubling, it is sometimes so disconcerting that you wonder, can you proceed? But you just got to put one foot in front of the other. I can use a less ableist concept, just keep moving forward, and believing that you are on the right side of history and that you're committed to making sure that students have access to the opportunities that are critical to higher education. I think the last thing that I would say is that you simply have to go around the country and be in a higher education environment. Whether you are at a community college, a technical college, a 4-year private elite institution like the one where I work, or a 4-year public, what you will find is that people are in those institutions because they want to make a difference in their lives, and they're hoping to influence other people as well. Right. Whether it's a younger sibling, or like the story that we just heard of the keynote, his mother getting a PhD in her 60s. When I went to college, it was because I had a great-grandmother who I happened to be talking to, who I didn't know very well, and she said to me, I was 20, and she said, "Why aren't you in school?" And I said, I dropped out, I don't have the money. And she said, I got my degree at the age of 62 after raising 8 children. And she became a kindergarten teacher at 62 years old and then taught until she was 87. And I was meeting her at 91, 92 years old and knew very little about that history. But I think all the time about that moment that she said, change your life today. And we know that higher education allows people to have access to those kinds of opportunities and to then go back and change other people's lives and influence other people. So we can't give up. That's my North Star, and I'm going to stick to it and stay on my little pedestal.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing the personal story about your own journey to post-secondary from high school and some of the challenges that you experienced along the way. That'll be very telling as we continue this conversation. I'm going to continue with you and ask for you to talk about a time when you've had to make some choices between what's politically correct and what's right in your view, how you anchored in that decision. And that brings us back to the title of our session on standing firm. We're in a time where we have to stand firm for the things that we know that are right for our students and for our communities.
Yeah, I think, there's so many examples. I mean, obviously I work in diversity, equity, inclusion, which is in particular under attack. And so there's many, many examples. But I think the one I'll harken back to is some years ago I was working at a private Southern institution that had a long history of interesting kind of complexities around racial diversity, and but had become a very diverse, racially diverse institution in the time that I had been there. I was there a dozen years. So sort of at the end of the journey, I was meeting with the president and our senior team, and it had come to my attention that there were Confederate monuments on the campus. I don't know how I had not known, but it wasn't apparent. They were sort of hidden behind grass, and we were about to renovate a welcome center. So we're having this deep discussion because we were also in a town that was trying to deal with its Confederate monuments. This is 2018. And so probably 2017 when I became aware, and then we worked over several months. So I remember sitting with other leaders at the college, and there were folks who were saying the Confederate monuments were established by a group called the Daughters of the Confederacy, and they had been established 80 years before. And so there were people on the cabinet that did not agree with the idea that we would remove these Confederate monuments. And I remember having to have debates with them, right? But really important debates, both about sort of understanding our positional differences in terms of our own racialized identities and backgrounds, but also talking openly about, what does it mean to have a historic site be so contested? And so while I think, we arrived at the right decision collectively, it did require capacity building. It required being able to dialogue across difference and not be sort of swayed by the idea that some people were going to be angry. And one way we did that was we just did our research. We dug deep. I had someone who said, well, were the Daughters of the Confederacy that bad? And so I went into the archives, and I looked up some of their history, and I was able to show that this particular chapter had decided that the Ku Klux Klan were their heroes, and they had named that very publicly. So if you have an organization like the Ku Klux Klan, it is avowed violence. It's not a pacifist organization. It is an organization that decided to attack African Americans during specific periods of time. It's irrefutable that that organization should not have monuments, right? Or that organization, anyone that would lift up that organization should not have monuments in front of a welcome center at a higher education institution in 2018. So you could decide where to put those, historic, that architecture, but you wouldn't want to have it at your welcome center. And then, of course, 2 to 3 years later, then many, many colleges began to make very public stances about Confederate monuments. But at that time, it was pretty controversial on our campus. And so I would say having those conversations, being worried about being able to look my colleagues in the eye, that was a hard moment, but it was such an important moment, and it's one that I have no regrets about.
Yeah. And that took a tremendous amount of courage to be able to stand up for something that you knew you had to do.
Yeah, maybe. I don't always consider myself courageous, but I consider myself aligned with purpose. And so I think in that moment, right, I felt like my purpose was to help those folks understand that moment.
Margaret, I'm going to ask you to talk about, I know you've had experience as a leader at the campus level, the system level, and you serve in a role where you're mentoring leaders now who are in these roles. How do you help leaders stay rooted in their mission and purpose in doing this work when we're in a time where people are telling them they may have to adapt to the changing tides? How do you help them stay grounded in that?
Helping them stay rooted and grounded in their mission. You know, many times you'll be in an environment where people will shift their vision, their mission to get resources, you know, to get the resources, to bring the resources to the table. And what I've found in this work, you know, we have to be anchored in something. And our mission in our institutions is really our why. Why do we exist? Why are we doing this work? And if you, you know, there's a thing that say you stand for something. If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And so as we are in this time, encouraging leaders to, what are we saying here? Our topic today is
Standing firm.
Stand firm on your mission. Don't shift so you can get something. Because what you're going to find yourself doing is constantly shifting to meet somebody else's needs and no longer serving your community, your population that you have identified to serve. Mission is at the core of everything we do. If we decide that we're going to move off of that, and I get asked a lot about mission and courage and, you know, what would you do? What did you do? And so as I have gone on to build institutions, our mission was to train a workforce. And because by some people's definition and perception, you know, community colleges and technical colleges are at the lowest level of the rung of higher ed. So as we were building an institution, even though I came out of community college, and I helped to reshape a community college, and then I helped to build a system. When we were doing that work, I was faced a lot of times with those who felt we needed to keep technical education without any of the criteria for higher ed, but they wanted to play in higher ed space. And then those who felt we were moving too far in a direction where for your institutions, and that really is a challenge for community colleges all the time, that people begin to see us as something different. And I say us because I am and will always be for two-year post-secondary education. So in holding on to the mission and encouraging you, you may have to adapt and modify your methods, but don't lose focus on what your why is. So I'm saying you sometimes have to create a move off of your how. You do what you say you're going to do, but you don't leave your why you were created, why you do what you said you were going to do. You know, and we find that many times institutions are starting to make those shifts. That's why, you know, you want to grow up and be something that you're not. You know,
Right.
I am concerned even with institutions that community colleges are now wanting to offer baccalaureate degrees. You know, and a lot of them are doing it. I know I'm not saying something that's popular right now by some folk, but we are going to have to. We should stay true to our mission. And I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to the courage, you know, the courage to continue to do what your mission says you're supposed to do.
Yes.
And to not be involved in the creep just to get the resources that you need.
Yeah.
I want to move into a conversation about the coalition building that we need to move into in this moment, and thinking about the civil rights movement and how we often hear people say, well, if I was around back then, I would have done X, Y, and Z. The movement and its power wasn't just about a moral clarity, it was about coalitions and building those coalitions. And so as we think about higher ed today, who needs to be a part of that coalition to help us defend education and the right to access for all for public education? Who should be in that coalition? Who should bring them in, and why? Do you want to start, Margaret?
Okay. Well, I'm like everybody at the table. Set the table and invite everybody to the table. Let's think about this. Ivy League's under siege. Now they're asking, they got to pay. You know, it's like pay to play is what we're dealing with right now. K through 12. They're being censored. Curriculum. They can't even offer. I live in a state, 100% charter schools. You ask them to show you the curriculum. You ask them to talk about the reading list. They've moved so much off. They're censoring the reading list, the librarians. But for us to survive this thing, we have to be about building coalitions and collaborations. I was like, our speaker this afternoon, he touched on so many points that are so important. Building those collaborations and coalitions are going to be key if we're going to survive this thing, whatever this thing is. Y'all may have a name for it. We're still trying to define it, what they're doing and how they're doing it. So in order for us to get through this, we need to find common goals. Each of us come to the table with our mission, but there's a commonality in there. And if you think about what higher education, in a very simple definition, is all about, higher education is the public goal that equips people with knowledge, skills, and experience to grow intellectually, contribute to society, and participate fully in workforce and democracy. It develops talent, advance discovery, and strengthen communities. You find a community with an uneducated population, and you're going to find a community in distress.
That's right.
I live there.
That's right.
I live in an environment where the primary source of the workforce is service, the service industry. That's low wage. You know, if we're going to continue to have that. So if we don't come together, recognizing that education determines who your population is and what your economics will be in your community, we're going to lose. We're not going to win this thing. But I believe, I'm optimistic, I really am optimistic that we're going to all come to the table. There have been other times. I can remember in 1989, now this dates me, but in 1989 and in the 80s, let's say, there was nobody talking about workforce development but community and technical colleges. Workforce money was put there. There were several programs that were there for workforce. Then all of a sudden, people followed the puck.
The conversation changed.
The conversation changed. The narrative has changed. Every conversation we have, we just finished having a conversation about economics and workforce. So workforce has always been at the core. But if we don't come together and recognize there's no parent in the United States of America sending any child to college that don't expect them to get a job one day, right? So we have to all come together and say, well, let's do what we do, K through 12. And everybody says, nobody can get a really living wage job unless you have 2 years beyond high school, right? And they've been saying that for some time. The thing that we have to now do is recognize we are in a crisis. We need to address this with some urgency and stop having these philosophical conversations about what we might do, how we might do it. You know, we have to roll the dice and do some things now. We have to be actionable, you know, because this is not a time for us to pontificate whether we're going to do this or not. I agree with the speaker. Don't waste this crisis.
Right.
Let's get busy and do something about it. So for me, the time is now. And in the work that I do, I kind of can nudge people on, encourage them, and I can go in and say things that people cannot say.
That's right.
And we'll talk about that when we get to being courageous, okay?
Yeah, it's interesting. I love this question, first of all. I think I happen to be this semester teaching a class called it's a first-year seminar, which is all 18-year-olds from around the world that have come to Mount Holyoke, and the class is called Women in the Civil Rights Movement. And I decided to teach this class because I was looking at the catalog and I didn't see a course at that time on the civil rights movement. And I thought, you know, thinking about what you just said, Margaret, like it's actually now more than ever, people need to understand how people work together. And so this past week in my course, we were watching a movie called Freedom Summer. It's one of my favorite documentaries on the history of the civil rights movement. We've watched Eyes on the Prize and Freedom Riders. And what's interesting is that when you look at the movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality, SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, all of these organizations worked together, but they worked in an intergenerational movement, right? College students to people in their 60s and 70s and 80s. Children were engaged in the civil rights movement. It was a multiracial movement. I mean, the solidarity between the Jewish community and the Black community at that time, in particular, many Holocaust survivors were entering the civil rights movement. They were also children of people who had survived the Holocaust or had been lost in the Holocaust. That was an intentional coalition building movement. And I'm not even naming some of the racial diversity that many of us do not realize. And I think And I'm thinking about this in particular because this week we were, the 3 civil rights workers that were killed, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney, you know, those people sacrificed so much to make sure that black people in the South, in Mississippi, could have the right to vote. And they did so, and did so intentionally when they had the right to vote. So when you think about how people in the civil rights movement understood that any American who does not have access to resources is not actually going to help us live our democracy more fully. And you can watch all of their narratives, all their speeches about why they made those choices to go into the South from their Northeastern schools, some of them. And that inspiration was like watching people be attacked for wanting to have the right to vote. It was just, to them, it did not make sense. And so I'll say one other piece about this. This summer, as I was preparing for the class, I had the opportunity to go study with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee Legacy Project, which is really SNCC members who are in their 80s, and they were teaching us how to teach about them. So we're in, you know, Washington, D.C., you know, I could name some of the names of folks that we would all remember if we recall that time period. And they're telling us, they're looking down at the White House and they've said to us, you cannot give up.
That's right.
You cannot get discouraged. We are still in this fight 50 years later because we know we're on the side of the right side of history, and we believe so much in everyone having access. And as a person who does DEI, one of the things I try to emphasize to people is that the lies, the mythology about DEI needs to continue to be constantly dispelled by us. It is antithetical to DEI to be divisive. It is antithetical to DEI to create more violence. It is actually the focus of DEI to be focused on life affirmation, making sure that human beings from diverse backgrounds can be in harmony with one another and focus on repair and reconciliation. That is our work, and we need to tell the truth about our work, and we need to be clear that we have the deepest truth about what that work looks like. There are always mistakes that are made in all the world, in all the ways that higher education operates, but there are things that we can continue to build upon that are the building blocks of the legacies that were forged by people long before us. And so not being discouraged and continuing to remember sort of our moral compass and our moral fortitude is really important, and that's what I think we learned from the civil rights movement.
And I was going to say that's what's going to require some courageous leadership, right? During this time period where we need people to not be afraid to speak up and to say the things. We're in a time period where that courage is more necessary now more than ever.
So I do know a freedom rider who I talked to, and he said, this is our civil rights moment right now. This is, and you know, we had the first Reconstruction right after the Civil War. Second Reconstruction was the Civil Rights Movement. We're moving into the third Reconstruction. And he is a Dillard grad, and it's always good to speak to him, but we don't want them to feel like their work was in vain.
Right.
So we will have to have some to step up, and I love what you said, and to have the opportunity to be under their tutelage this summer must have been like this life-changing. And so we have to be that. You know, we have to be the change we want to see.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'd like to talk a little bit about higher education and the promise that it offers to students and why it's so important. And we have a tension when we talk about higher education. You know, we all in this room are here at this conference because we believe that education changes lives. We also know that institutions can produce inequities and that this attack against DEI is a part of that challenge. So how do leaders make a credible defense of higher education while we continue to reckon with some of its shortcomings? Kijua, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I was thinking about, you know, there's a current wave or attack against higher education administrators around anti-Semitism on campus, which is really a response to the events of October 7th, 2023 that happened in Israel and Palestine. And you know, people are really reticent to talk about this openly, and I think one of the things that I have thought about doing this work on college campuses is that college campuses have historically been Christian normative institutions, and even Christian hegemonic institutions. What I mean by that is that At these institutions, right, holidays are built around Christian holidays, right? If you are Jewish or Muslim or atheist or pagan or Wiccan on campus, your holidays are actually not built into when the holiday breaks take place. I mean, that's actually true. Like, there's no disputing that, right? And also, we have not done enough, I think, on college campuses to address Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and all the forms of isms that perpetuate some of the divisiveness that happens on our campuses. So then when something that is a global event happens, and it happens to groups of people that are far away from us but directly impact us, right? Because anytime we're watching a genocide happen in real time, we know that, and these are genocides that are happening across the world, right? We know that those are actually connected to who we are as human beings, because any human being who's subject to violence on this planet, we're interdependent. We're not disconnected from one another. So there are folks who were lost, right, to these moments in history. And so it's important for us as higher education institutions to think about, so what can we learn about the things we're not doing well, and then how do we attend to those things? So at Mount Holyoke, where I work, for example, we've had teach-ins on anti-Semitism since 2021. We've had teach-ins on Islamophobia since 2022. We had been engaged in deep discourse about what it meant at an institution like ours to have students who needed to understand like how these histories were interconnected, and then to find ways to build solidarity with one another. And I think that helped us when students were wanting to speak out and speak up because of their different backgrounds related to the incidents that were happening globally. We could actually respond to those in real time, and also do some sort of deep diving within ourselves about like what could we be doing better to show up around these discussions. We're also a gender diverse women's college, which means that we are a college that accepts women, those individuals who identify as women who are trans and non-binary, gender non-conforming, people who identify as non-binary or gender non-conforming across the gender diversity spectrum. And for me, as a person who has for a long time, I worked 20 years at women's colleges, I've always been really interested in making sure that trans and non-binary students felt accepted at places like the places where I've worked, even when other folks felt like, we're at a women's college, this is a gendered institution, why would we have this inclusive mission? Why would we be expansive? Our mission was about being created at a time when women did not have access to higher education. So if anything, we should open our access even further to make sure that people who are marginalized and targeted because of their gender would also have access to our institution. So it was very clear for us how to make that decision about whether TGNC students would be welcome and affirmed, and that's been part of how I see the ways that higher education has to respond, adapt, and be supportive of individuals across diverse backgrounds. And when we're being called in, we should respond to that call in by showing up better. And I do think that this is a moment where we're having to kind of have those conversations. And some institutions were ready for those conversations, and some institutions were not. And we're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think we had done some capacity building that helped us dig deeper on some of the global incidents that we were seeing.
Yeah, that's great.
I think one thing, as in the diversity, equity, and inclusion world, we need to all understand different is just different. Different is not bad. Different is different. And just because you're different, but I think what is happening, we've made such a difference in the differences, and we don't respect differences. Because that's really what it is all about. At the core, it's very simple, and it's gotten to the point where different is bad. And at every level. As again, no buffers left. I just wanted to add different is not bad. Different is just different. And that is at the core, to me, what is really happening with all these conversations and all these uprisings on campuses and people's feelings. And faculty, which, they sabotage their own power when they don't do, they want to hang on to freedom of speech, but you really don't want to have the deep conversations. Yeah. Your institution is different. I live in Louisiana. We had the governor go on campus and say he wants to erect a statue of a certain person when 1,500 people came to a function and there had 32,000 people on the campus. But, different is just different. It's not bad, and we need to recognize that.
Well, and that leads me back to a question on the equity and the work and the people who are doing the work. You know, when you do the equity work, it's often very difficult, and especially in this political climate. And so how do we protect the people who are leading this work? And how do we protect the faculty and the staff and the students who are on campuses that are undermining this work and the value of this work? How do we protect them from burnout, retaliation in this political climate?
So we go back to a situation where different is different is not bad. Language. You know, this whole, I think we talked about this at maybe 2 other convenings where we talked about difference, the language. When it began to bubble up that they were going to deal with diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think it was Commissioner Kim Hunter-Reid from Louisiana. We had a panel that was talking about this, and she had a good legislative session where Louisiana was beginning to talk about eliminating certain criteria related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And she was able to get them off of that for the moment, okay? But of course it came back up again. But it is about language. And now we have, if you haven't seen the list of allowable terms. So what do we do with faculty and staff? And this, again, connects to the mission of the institution and the work, okay? So you need to change the language, but you don't need to change the mission. You need to hold to the mission of the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because if not, we're going to lose Title III, we're going to lose. They have figured out how to misinterpret just about every piece of legislation, every policy. And once again, that's another piece of it. You have to also address your policies on your campus and help faculty. But you do not need to run away from it. You need to run to it and put mechanisms and processes in place to help educate your people internally about how you're going to do this. How are we going to still do our work in the midst of this crisis?
Thank you for that.
Yeah, first, I was thinking about Fannie Lou Hamer saying, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." And I think about, Fannie Lou Hamer and other people like her. So, she's a civil rights activist, right, who was in her late 50s, 60s, was beaten for wanting to vote in Mississippi, and then became this outspoken public force that shook even the presidency at the time, right? And so in Rock Hill, South Carolina, some years ago, there was a movement to ban 97 books from a school library. 3 young people, 3 high school students, decided to speak up and resist those books being banned, 97 books being banned in their high school. They formed a coalition, and this coalition was other students who would also fight to make sure that these books were not banned in their high school. Then they they got together with other teachers. And then there's a film, there's a documentary. I would strongly encourage you to watch this incredible documentary called Band Together. And it's about book bans and how important it is for us to speak out in our communities, in our local places, around book bans that are happening in schools. And this is directly connected to higher education. The fight, the defending the right to learn. I mean, when you think about books, actually have their own ability to transform people, whether they have access to higher education or not. When I was struggling to learn, I would read books when I was in a high school, right? And books were the portal to me for an outside world. And so I think we really need to continue to think about what are the ways that K through 12 and higher education can continue to band together around some of these issues that are affecting all of us, right? I think we also need to think about what are the ways that even when Fannie Lou Hamer was saying, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," she wasn't giving up the fight. She was saying, "I'm tired, but I'm actually going to help other people understand why we should continue to speak up." And so for me, how I stay in the movement is I continue to think about the young people I'm working with. I mean, they inspire me every day, and I want to make sure that when I'm talking with them, we can talk openly about our differences, our different beliefs, our different understandings of things. I welcome dissent and understand that an intellectually rigorous environment allows me to grow as a human being and think about the places where I need to improve, and it allows hopefully that reciprocal learning to take place where they're learning as well. And that is actually a part of defending the right to learn, right? Our ability to be able to engage across difference, to be able to have those hard conversations about why books are being banned or why maybe why I have certain beliefs that I hold that others do not hold and why people believe differently from me. And one of the most transformative experiences I had in higher education, that I'll just give as an anecdote and then move on to the next question, is I remember years ago I was at my community college, and at the time I had just gone there to get a 2-year degree. I didn't even know I was going to answer the question this way, so I'll tell this very quickly.
This is great.
But I was at my community college. I was there to get a 2-year degree. I had been fired from a job, and I thought, like, I just need a 2-year degree to get a better job. I had no idea I was going to go get a master's or a PhD. I had no idea I was going to be a college administrator. None of that was at all in my wheelhouse. My father had been incarcerated, and my brother had been incarcerated. And my brother was incarcerated at the time. They're both now deceased. But I was thinking, like, I need to get a better job because I don't want to end up in prison, and I also want to be able to help them in some way, my brother at the time in particular. So in my class, I'm taking a class in African American Studies. I fell in love with this one professor, the way he taught us, the way he inspired us, the way he encouraged us. And I would take African American Studies and sociology from him. I took like 5 classes from him. And he's the person who said, you need to go on to get a bachelor's degree. But anyway, I'm in class one day. I walk in the door, and instead of him being in our class, there was another faculty member in our class. And she started talking to us, and she said, I was having lunch with my colleague, Dr. Price, who was the person who taught our class. And she said, we decided to switch classes. She says, I teach Asian American Studies, and there are only Asian students in my class. And he teaches Black Studies. This is 1990s, okay? He teaches Black Studies, and there are only Black students in his class. And we were talking about the racial divide. There had been a lot happening in Southern California around Black and Asian relations at that time. And we decided, why don't we just switch classes for a week? And that's where I first learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act. I learned about the Japanese internment camps. I had never even understood that other people had been marginalized in the ways that they had in my own country, right? And so for me, that was an actually transformative moment. It probably led me on the path to diversity, equity, inclusion, even though I've had many other jobs since then. But my point about that is that exchange, that willingness to sit in community with one another, those 2 faculty members, and have a lunchtime conversation that then made them go back and change their curriculum and just expose students in their 2 different classes. I don't even know that people would let things like that happen at a higher education institution now. That creativity and innovation and imagination was absolutely life-changing to me. And at this moment, I can still be in community with folks who are talking about, like, how do we build coalitions across our different racialized experiences because of the information that I gained in that classroom, and because in my own limited way, I began to understand, like, wow, I've experienced different forms of oppression and targeting, but so have many, many other people. So actually, I should be in solidarity with thinking about how the common enemy is ignorance. The common enemy is not other people.
Yes, yes.
Right? And that's actually what I'm, always thinking about when I think about higher education.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Sorry for that very long anecdote.
No, that was a great anecdote. And that's actually a great way for us to bring members of our audience into the conversation, because you all have provided us a really strong foundation on the topic, the importance of this, the relevance, and the need for us to take action. So I would like to give opportunity for members of our audience to ask questions of our panelists to keep this conversation going. We'll make sure you have a microphone. Please share with us your name and then your question.
Hi, everyone. Carmen Walters, former president of Tougaloo College, and I've enjoyed the discussion. And it's been interesting listening to Dr. Sanders-McMurtry talking about Goodwin, Cheney, and Schwerner, which happened in Meridian, Mississippi, and then to mention Fannie Lou Hamer, also of Mississippi. And many of her speeches that she made was on my campus at Tougaloo. So when she's leaning on the podium, that is the chapel on the campus. And so my question for you is, how do we, as higher ed, reach into or collaborate with the Church Universal, not just the Black church as we did in the 60s? We know that Dr. King was not this wonderful big leader. He was a Black preacher who became, right, this wonderful intellectual leader. So what role does the church have? Because Goodwin, Cheney, and Schwerner, they were in a small church in Meridian teaching people about voting. And especially when we think about education, we know that we've moved away from the way we were educated. Now we have these standards So you really can't help a 9-year-old with homework. You know, you got to know how they do it, not how we do it. So what role does the Universal Church have in this, assisting us with standing firm, moving forward, and this whole legacy of leadership in the higher ed promise?
Yeah, I love that you brought that up. I think it's so interesting. There's a couple things to think about, right? The churches, the synagogues, the mosques, the places of worship and faith stand strong for all of us that are actually connected to them. If we have a spiritual connection to a place like a church or mosque, a synagogue, or another entity, typically that's like sort of a guidepost for many of us, right? That's like our moral compass. And so I think that one of the reasons why they were so effective during the civil rights movement and and why churches were such an important place is because that was where you came to experience the sacred, you came to experience the wholeness of your fullness of your humanity. And what's so powerful about the students who were coming from all the colleges in the world, as I said, some of them are around the nation, some of them were Jewish, and they were in Christian churches, right, singing freedom songs and being engaged in the coalition building. So I think that churches still can play a very active role, and some do, in galvanizing people, bringing people together, getting people the opportunities for education. There's an incredible book called Fugitive Pedagogy by Jarvis Givens. There's a few books that come to mind immediately. There's one by Heather Andrea Williams. I cannot remember the name of the book right now, but it's about sort of how enslaved folks created their sort of own self-emancipation through education. In these books, they talk a lot about how these sort of places where you could come together in mass as group and have a protected, sacred space for challenging the ways that you were learning in the classroom were actually allowed for what they call fugitive pedagogy, right? Like the countercultural understanding of like when books are being banned in schools, you can take books to your churches and help people learn the same books that are being banned in schools. You can take them to your churches and make sure that they're proliferating there. So I think that there's still a very vibrant, active way to do that. And the other thing is, I mean, we cannot forget that both Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King would name their Christianity as the reason why they were engaged in social justice struggle. And I want to just make a real quick note about Coretta Scott King. So many people do not realize that Coretta Scott King was an activist before she was married to Martin Luther King Jr., and she was an activist to her last days, right? She was an activist who was incarcerated fighting against apartheid in South Africa. She was standing with Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez when, as migrant workers, they were fighting in fasting, right, to make sure that migrant workers had rights. She brought Matthew Shepard's mom on stage with her when he was killed for being a gay teen in Midwest America. She also, she spoke up for LGBTQ plus rights. She was doing so much. And she once said, "I'm not a ceremonial symbol, I'm an activist." So much of like what we have done to erase her legacy and to sanitize how radical her and Dr. King were, both as revolutionaries of themselves, has been intentional, to contribute to this discourse that you can't be radical and be engaged in civil rights struggle and be a Christian, right? So they were very intentionally pushing against that. And when we tell their stories, we should tell the fuller stories of who they were. Thank you. Yeah, she has two books. One is called Help Me to Find My People, which is about how enslaved folks were writing letters to each other. But the one you're talking about is the one I was talking about, self-taught.
I'll allow you to respond, and then I see there's one more
I
question.
wasn't going to respond necessarily. I just probably had a question with a question, because in today, this modern time, about the role of the church, particularly African-American church, there are a few probably very active ministers, but not as many. And how will they come together? I guess a lot of people don't have as much confidence in what the capacity of the church is to move where we are forward. And so, and living in New Orleans, where the Southern Christian group really galvanized, we had lots going on there. They met at Dookie Chase. And so, is this a question, is this a comment for thought? following your question, where does it fit now? How do they show up?
Well, I was going to ask a question, but all these thoughts went around, so now I got comments and questions. So I'm Eddie Howard, Dr. Eddie Howard. I am now working for CCA as a coach, but I did have a comment. I think the thing that's fascinating me as you were talking, the church has always had a place. I mean, that's where the church were the first places that we would begin to get our education, even as slaves.
Yes,
The only thing we could do was do church on Sunday, and so that's where reading started. So to say that the church didn't have a place in education, particularly for African Americans, to me it just blows my mind, because the church has always been in the foundation of what we do. But my point of the question I had was, one of the things I struggled with when I was in a situation where I supervised folks that were responsible for DEI work, is I pushed them all the time, and the comment I used to make to them is that we're all in the same boat, but we're navigating different waters. And so we have to be cognizant of the other issues that our other folks in the struggle are dealing with. And there were so many silos that were really created by people that were doing the work, which really blew my mind. And I was like, and I got so much resistance from individuals who were in charge of those areas to try to bring about allyship across all of the groups that we were working with. And you are not doing your work if your focus is on African American students alone.
Right.
And I got Muslim students, I got Jewish students, there was so much pushback from that I began to think, well, do I need to educate the people that are doing the work on what the work really is? Because they're not fully understanding that their responsibility is not to support their individual group, but to bring about this understanding for all students in that space, in addition to providing allyship for anybody that's interested in helping, like you said, inviting everybody to the table. So that's my first question. I do have another question, but that's my first question. How do we get people that are doing the work to fully understand what their role is?
Yeah, one thing I want to say is I actually think that the one thing that is important about doing diversity, equity, inclusion work is there are valid critiques of work. All of our work, right? I mean, anything that we do, there are valid critiques of higher education, there are valid critiques of diversity, equity, inclusion work. So I don't ever want to dismiss the fact that what you named, and I know Dr. Howard, so I'll say, so I didn't know you were going to ask a question, or this question in particular, but what I would say is that, for example, the discourse around freedom of expression and academic freedom, where it becomes reductionist is this idea that you cannot, that you can't have a position. You can have a position. You can have an understanding that something that you're talking about actually is harmful to other people, and that we don't condone violence. That is a position. But where the diversity of perspectives piece is a critique that we continue to examine is really important. And often people are coming from their very siloed place of doing the work. And so I'll say a quick example for me is I remember years ago, Charlottesville had happened. There was a protest in Charlottesville. It happened right around my birthday, and I just was not paying attention. And a student came in my office. Someone had said, you got to send out a letter or a statement. Back when we used to put out statements to the colleges all the time, to the campus community. And I had written this statement. I'd actually not done my own research, to be completely honest with you. I'd gone with sound bites. People had told me there were signs. It was anti-black. It was white supremacists. They said all these things. But I had not done my due diligence of really figuring out what was the march about. So I wrote this statement to the campus community, and a student came in my office, and she said, "I'm so disappointed in you." I was a dean of students at the time. And she said, "I'm so disappointed in you. You left out that they were chanting, 'Jews will not replace us,' and that they were intentionally anti-Semitic in their work." And I remember being so surprised, right? And instead of being defensive, I thought to myself, well, I must have missed this mark. Let me go do this work and do my own interior kind of examination of why did I leave out, in my discourse around it, why did I only focus on black people? Well, I'm black, right? So that's one bias I had already. And then I actually just had not done my due diligence. So I apologized to that student. I needed to make some modifications. I wanted to get out to the Jewish community and say, I'm sorry. I failed to acknowledge the harm that was done to you all. And I made a commitment to myself that I would never do that again, that I would pay close attention to how Christian normativity influenced my perspective in that moment. I can still identify all the ways I identify. I can stand in my truth about who I am, but I can also recognize when I make a mistake and I harm and exclude other people, and DEI people are just as capable of doing that as anyone else, right? So even as I was talking earlier and I was naming different groups, I was like, I didn't mention the Hindu community. I didn't mention like all these faiths. In my head, it was all playing out, right? So that is, right, that's an interior work that we need to be able to do. And I do think that DEI has failed to do that sometimes. And that is a valid critique of DEI professionals and educators, because we're human, we're fallible, but we also have to be willing to do the work of saying, okay, so I did make that mistake and exclude someone. How do I now repair? And that repair work is critical to all of what we're talking about: repair, acknowledgement, atonement, and then being willing to dig deeper and make sure that if you don't know about something, that you then educate yourself so that you can then educate the masses is really important to being a DI educator. And I'm only answering because you asked about that specifically.
I just want to add that I'm thankful for you sharing that, because as an HBCU president, I'm sorry, somebody's wanted the mic?
After you, there's a question in the back.
Okay, just as an HBCU leader, people have that understanding in their minds that historically Black colleges only focus on African Americans, and we know that the data shows that HBCUs are some of the most diverse institutions, and it's terrible that we can't tell that story well enough so that the masses can understand that we are focused on other cultures and how important that is to bring those other cultures in. So I'm just happy that you talked about that.
Yeah, I would add, like, there's so many examples of institutions that are historically Black colleges having South Asian students there, and international students and Latine students. Miles College intentionally went after a Latine population some years ago, right? There's a beautiful exhibit on Jewish faculty that went to teach at HBCUs after, right? So HBCUs have actually been a beacon in many ways for making sure that people from racially diverse backgrounds had opportunity.
So, yes, hello. So I'm Dr. Lover Chancellor, and I'm at the University of Central Missouri. And so my current role is the director of the center. My educational background, and I'm a tenured faculty in HDFS, and I work on inclusion and understanding differences. So when you mentioned earlier, Dr. Montgomery-Richard, when you mentioned about the title and the word, and so I've done workshops around, because we're in one of those states where you're going to change it and flip it and roll it around, but the work, right? Is it what we call it, or is it the work that we're doing that's most important? And one of the things that used to be is that you used to have that class. Like, it was required on our campus of every incoming freshman to have a valuing differences class. And I think sometimes the confusion comes in is we don't understand that difference is so wide. We're not talking just race or religion. We're talking whether you're rural or what all the things. And so when we pigeonholed it to just talk about the differences on the outside, it kind of became a class that you could throw things at and it not sustain. And so I'm wondering, how do we create something that explains the necessariness of understanding about everyone, right? You can't be an expert on everyone. I'm in that space. I can't speak from a Jewish lens because I'm not Jewish. And when I start off in saying or presenting myself, I tell them the lens in which I'm speaking from and opening it up to that there are intersections out there that I may have that you don't, but we're not experts on everything. And sometimes they think because I'm in that office, everything I need to speak about. When things came out during COVID about the Asian community, well, you need to put out a statement. What I'm gonna say? Like, I can research, but we have Asian faculty on our campus. Why are we not going and using the resources around and not just depending on the one person who's supposed to be the person that you're leaning on to help diversify or make statements about the campus? So just leaning into your what is differences and things like that.
So DE&I is also about inclusion, right? And so when you have a source, and that's when we have to open up our minds and our lens and invite different people to the table within the institution. You know, many times in this work, particularly us who are doing coaching, and we go into these institutions and you get the same people doing the same work, and so there's no broader perspective. And you're really shortchanging yourself in your decision-making process. As leaders, you really have to go, you said something that I love about going deeper, and that's in everything, You have to understand that you can't make these surface decisions anymore. You can't make the decision in your office. Just because you have the title doesn't mean you know everything about it, okay? So in my world, as it always have been, and I know people who work for me can testify that, I go out and I seek other people's input. I encourage, I believe in having deeper conversations, okay? Because if we don't have those conversations, we limit our ability to really do what we need to do for people we're trying to serve. And if we believe in that, I've not worked at a historically black college. So for me, and you've worked in all of those places, and so for me, I've always had to go deeper and be more inclusive, because it could be as simple as not even dealing with ethnicity, but just dealing with, in our environment, it's the parish or the community they came from. Bringing institutions, bringing programs and services to various institutions. So I don't want to limit it to just ethnicity, but difference is different. But people have differences all across the spectrum, and you have to almost be willing to have conversations and let other people bring their perspective and those differences to the table so you could address them accordingly. And you're still going to miss some stuff. You're never going to get it all, I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, and thank you to our audience for participating in this conversation today. I told you we would not go over time, and we have gone over time. I'd like to close out by asking our panelists if there's anything that they were hoping we would cover or anything you were hoping that you would answer today that we didn't get to. I want to allow you time for a final thought before we wrap up this discussion today.
I guess I didn't go as deep about courageous leadership, and that it does take courage, but there's a question I always ask someone when we're talking about being courageous in your work. You as an individual must always think about your risk factor. What is your risk tolerance? And at different stages in your career, you can make different types of decisions. When your career is young, you may have to make more conservative decisions, but as you mature in the work, your tolerance, like for me, example, I can go in and help my people and say things that you can't as a younger person in your career. So being courageous, you have to decide. You have to think about it, and you should think about it. Don't be afraid to think about it. But always in your work, maintain your integrity, maintain who you are, because you have to look in the mirror, So looking at the man in the mirror, looking at the woman in the mirror.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I'll pick up on courageous leadership. I think courageous leadership requires humility. I think, sometimes when people are driven by ego, it's because there's a deep insecurity about whatever, right? Any number of things. And I won't go into any political leaders, but I'll just name that, that when the ego is loud, often I think it's that, which allows me to have then humility in interacting with people who are different from me in terms of even perspective, right? And so, for me, it's really about honoring the human being's ability to be able to be a critical thinker and critically engage ideas and concepts with me. But ultimately, I think the courageous piece comes from having humility and being willing to make mistakes and being willing to be seen as a person that makes mistakes. And so when you're called in, and I follow this philosophy around restorative justice, when you're called in, how do you then make sure that someone who says, hey, that what you said or did was harmful, could you please have a different position or continue to have dialogue with me? How do you allow that discourse to happen in a way that honors the humanity of all the people involved? I think it's really important to be a courageous leader. And I happen to work for someone who's an incredibly courageous leader, who's the president of Mount Holyoke right now. She is a civil rights lawyer. She's been incredibly outspoken. She was formerly dean of the Howard University Law School, and she's been very clear that she is not going to let Mount Holyoke not have a DEI office, and she's gone out very publicly and said, she's been on CNN and all the different news stations, and she said that she believes that actually DEI is the engine of excellence, that the idea that DEI is somehow subversively demeaning students' experiences in college is actually not true. And so it allows me to be more bold and me to be more courageous. I probably would be who I am anyway, as my mom always says, and my mom calls me regularly to say, you're not gonna have a job, and I'm like, that's okay, I'm still gonna do this work. Whether I have the title or the position, to your point, right, like, it may be that all these things are gonna change, but that's actually not going to change the belief that I have that the work that we're doing is so important collectively. All of you sitting in this room, the work that you're doing is incredibly important. We're at this conference because we believe that students should have the opportunity to complete college, and we want to make sure that we address the barriers and hindrances to their success and their excellence. And so we're here for that reason. This work is incredibly valuable, and no one can deter us from believing that this work is actually so important. So that's what I think courageous leadership requires, is like having an understanding of the foundation and being grounded in what you believe the purpose of all of this is. Otherwise, it's very easy to be destabilized and demoralized, right? And so that's why it's not hard for me to know very quickly, like when something is bumping up against something I'm trying to learn, how to follow up with my own need to understand and learn that, but then also how I can stay firm in the idea and stand firm in the idea that even when I'm making mistakes, my intent is something that I'm focused on continuing to cultivate, and that I know that I want to stand firm on college completion for all students. That's my barometer, so that's a really easy thing to stay invested in. Thank you all so much for being with us.
That was
for
great.
leading us.
That was great closing. I think she closed us out. Let's thank our panelists for being with us today. Thank you.